You're walking through the respectable streets of Victorian London in 1867, past perfectly manicured gardens and elegant townhouses where proper ladies sip tea behind lace curtains. The gaslight flickers against cobblestones as carriages roll by carrying gentlemen in top hats who tip their caps politely to passing ladies. Everything appears pristine, moral, and utterly civilized. But if you knew where to look, if you understood the coded language and secret signals, you'd discover that beneath this veneer of respectability lay a hidden world so scandalous, so utterly depraved, that it would make your blood run cold. Behind those respectable facades, in basements and back rooms, in private clubs and secret societies, Victorian society was indulging in pleasures so forbidden that acknowledging their existence could destroy reputations, end careers, and tear apart families. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of historical hypocrisy. It's the story of how an entire civilization built elaborate systems to hide their darkest desires while publicly condemning the very behaviors they privately craved. The truth about Victorian sexuality has been sanitized, whitewashed, and buried beneath layers of proper historical narrative. But the evidence remains, hidden in private diaries, police records, and the testimonies of those brave enough to speak. Tonight, we're going to pull back that curtain and reveal the shocking reality of what really happened when the lights went down in respectable Victorian society. Before diving into these hidden stories of desire and deception, if you enjoy uncovering the buried truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these forbidden histories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with what lies beneath the surface of civilized society. To understand the spectacular hypocrisy of Victorian sexual culture, you first need to understand the impossible standards that society demanded. This was an era where table legs were covered with fabric because bare wood might suggest human limbs and therefore provoke improper thoughts. Women were expected to be so pure that they supposedly felt no sexual desire whatsoever. Men were told that any sexual activity outside of marriage for procreation would lead to madness, blindness, and spiritual damnation. The official Victorian worldview held that respectable people simply didn't have sexual urges beyond what was necessary for producing children. Books were written, sermons were preached, and laws were passed, all reinforcing this impossible ideal of human purity. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. The very people creating these moral standards were the same ones secretly violating them in the most elaborate and systematic ways imaginable. The disconnect between public morality and private behavior wasn't just hypocrisy. It was a carefully constructed system that allowed the wealthy and powerful to indulge their desires while maintaining their respectable facades. They created a shadow economy of pleasure that operated parallel to legitimate society, complete with its own rules, hierarchies, and brutal consequences for those who threatened to expose it. The most obvious manifestation of this hidden world was the explosion of prostitution that occurred during the Victorian era. But this wasn't the crude street walking that moral reformers like to condemn in public. This was a sophisticated industry that catered to every taste, every fetish, every forbidden desire that respectable society claimed didn't exist. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the unfortunate women working the streets, driven by poverty and desperation into a trade that offered survival at the cost of social death. These women, often as young as 12 or 13, were the visible face of Victorian vice that reformers could point to with horror while ignoring the vast network that created and sustained their misery. But above them existed layers of increasingly elaborate and expensive services. There were the parlor houses, disguised as respectable boarding establishments, where middle-class clients could indulge discreetly. The madams who ran these operations were often women of considerable business acumen who understood that discretion was their most valuable commodity. They maintained careful records of their clients' preferences, ensured absolute confidentiality, and created an atmosphere that allowed men to forget, temporarily, the moral constraints of their public lives. Higher still in this hierarchy were the private clubs and exclusive establishments that catered to the wealthy elite. These weren't crude brothels, but sophisticated pleasure palaces designed to fulfill fantasies that went far beyond simple sexual transactions. The Cremorne Gardens in Chelsea, officially a respectable entertainment venue, was notorious among those in the know as a place where arrangements could be made and connections established. During the day, families would stroll through its gardens, enjoying innocent entertainments. At night, it transformed into something entirely different. The most exclusive establishments operated with such discretion that they barely left traces in the historical record. Private houses in fashionable districts like Belgravia and Mayfair would host gatherings that combined social dining with sexual entertainment. These events were attended by members of parliament, judges, military officers, and even clergy. The guest lists read like a who's who of Victorian society, yet officially, these gatherings never happened. What makes these arrangements so remarkable is the elaborate systems of secrecy that surrounded them. Communication happened through coded messages in seemingly respectable publications. The Times and other newspapers carried personal advertisements that appeared innocent but conveyed specific information to those who understood the code. A gentleman seeking particular services might advertise for a French governess with experience in discipline, or a young woman interested in artistic photography. Those in the trade understood exactly what these phrases meant. The women who participated in this shadow economy came from every level of society, though poverty was usually the driving force. Some were domestic servants who supplemented their meager wages with evening work. Others were shop girls, seamstresses, or factory workers, whose legitimate employment barely provided survival wages. The lucky few who managed to establish themselves in the higher levels of the trade could earn more in a week than most working women made in a year. But the cost was enormous. Once a woman entered this world, returning to respectable society became nearly impossible. The Victorian obsession with female purity meant that any woman suspected of sexual impropriety was forever marked as fallen. There was no redemption, no second chances, no path back to respectability. Society had created a system where women could be destroyed by the very men who used their services, who could return to their respectable lives, while their partners in sin were forever condemned. The psychological impact on these women was devastating. Many turned to alcohol or opium to numb the shame and despair of their circumstances. Others developed elaborate fantasies about escape or redemption that would never materialize. The suicide rate among prostitutes was extraordinarily high, but these deaths were rarely investigated thoroughly. Society preferred to view these women as inherently corrupt rather than acknowledge the system that created their desperation. Perhaps most disturbing was how this underground economy influenced legitimate Victorian society. The same moral authorities who publicly condemned vice were often its best customers. Judges who sentenced women to harsh punishments for prostitution might visit them the same evening. Politicians who gave speeches about protecting innocent womanhood were often the ones exploiting vulnerable women behind closed doors. The hypocrisy wasn't accidental. It was structural, built into the very foundations of how Victorian society operated. The evidence for these systematic contradictions comes from multiple sources that paint a picture of breathtaking moral fraud. Police records show that raids on brothels were often preceded by warnings that allowed the most important clients to escape. Court cases reveal judges who were remarkably lenient with certain defendants while harsh with others, suggesting that influence and money could purchase very different forms of justice. Private diaries and letters, discovered decades later, provide intimate glimpses into this hidden world. Respectable gentlemen wrote detailed accounts of their evening adventures, describing elaborate scenarios and specific services with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. These documents reveal men who lived completely separate moral lives, switching between public righteousness and private indulgence with stunning ease. The medical profession provided perhaps the most shocking example of this systematic deception. Victorian doctors publicly warned about the dangers of sexual excess while privately facilitating the very behaviors they condemned. Physicians would diagnose respectable wives with hysteria and recommend treatments that were nothing more than sanctioned sexual release. Meanwhile, these same doctors maintained detailed knowledge of the underground pleasure networks, referring wealthy clients to specific establishments while publicly supporting moral purity campaigns. Dr. William Acton, one of the era's most influential medical authorities on sexuality, wrote extensively about the supposed absence of sexual desire in respectable women. Yet private correspondence reveals that he regularly provided medical certificates excusing gentlemen from their marital duties so they could pursue other interests. His public writings described female sexuality as virtually non-existent, while his private practice catered to men seeking justification for their extramarital activities. The contradiction extended into the highest levels of medical authority. The Royal College of Physicians included members who publicly supported legislation criminalizing various sexual behaviors while privately operating or investing in the very establishments that facilitated them. Medical journals published stern warnings about sexual excess alongside discreet advertisements for treatments that promised to restore masculine vigor depleted by secret indulgences. Perhaps nowhere was this hypocrisy more elaborate than in the private clubs that dotted London's most respectable neighbourhoods. The Athenaeum, the Carlton, the Reform Club, these bastions of gentlemanly respectability served as more than just places for political discussion and quiet dining. Within their walls, members organised gatherings that would have scandalised their public supporters. The Hellfire Club, though officially disbanded decades earlier, had spiritual successors operating under different names throughout the Victorian period. These organisations maintained the facade of scholarly or charitable societies, while hosting events that combined ritualistic elements with sexual entertainment. Members included prominent politicians, military officers, and religious leaders who used elaborate ceremonies and secret oaths to bind themselves in mutual complicity. Meeting records, when they survive at all, are written in careful code that disguises the true nature of these gatherings. References to philosophical discussions about ancient Greek customs actually described elaborate reenactments of classical orgies. Charitable events to support fallen women were often opportunities to recruit new participants for private entertainments. Archaeological expeditions to study ancient fertility cults provided cover for modern recreations of supposedly academic interest. The women who participated in these elite gatherings occupied a strange social position. They weren't the desperate street prostitutes that moral reformers loved to condemn, nor were they the middle-class madams who ran commercial establishments. These were often educated women, sometimes from respectable families, who had fallen on hard times, who understood that their participation in these events was both their salvation and their damnation. Some had been introduced to this world through seemingly legitimate channels. A young woman might answer an advertisement for a companion to an elderly gentleman, only to discover that her duties extended far beyond reading aloud and playing cards. Others were recruited through networks of existing participants, each woman carefully vetted for discretion and adaptability before being introduced to increasingly exclusive circles. The most successful of these women developed personas that allowed them to move between worlds with remarkable skill. By day, they might appear as respectable governesses, seamstresses, or shop assistants. By evening, they transformed into sophisticated entertainers capable of discussing literature, politics, and philosophy, while providing whatever services their wealthy clients demanded. This double life required extraordinary psychological resilience and acting ability. But the strain was enormous. Letters and diary entries from women who managed to escape this world describe the constant fear of discovery, the psychological exhaustion of maintaining multiple identities, and the growing sense of disconnection from any authentic sense of self. Many developed what we would now recognize as dissociative disorders, creating elaborate mental compartments to separate their public and private selves. The economic dynamics of this hidden world revealed the true depths of Victorian society's moral bankruptcy. Respectable businesses often served as fronts for less legitimate activities. Dress shops, millinery establishments, and boarding houses frequently operated as recruitment centers or meeting places for those seeking discreet services. The proprietors of these businesses understood that their respectability depended on maintaining perfect facades while facilitating activities that could destroy them if exposed. Banking and financial institutions played crucial roles in sustaining this shadow economy. Discreet loans allowed women to establish themselves in the trade, while complex financial arrangements enabled wealthy clients to support their favorite establishments without leaving obvious paper trails. Some of London's most respected financial houses had entire departments dedicated to managing the complex transactions that kept this underground world functioning. The legal system provided another layer of protection for those wealthy enough to purchase it. Magistrates and judges, who were themselves participants in this hidden world, ensured that prosecutions were selective and punishments variable. Working-class women caught in street prostitution faced harsh sentences, while those who serviced the elite rarely appeared in court at all. When they did, mysterious technicalities often led to dismissed charges or minimal penalties. Police corruption was systematic and institutionalized. Officers who discovered high-end establishments understood that their career prospects depended on selective blindness. Those who proved reliable in protecting important clients found themselves promoted and rewarded, while those who showed excessive moral scruples found their careers mysteriously stalled. The Metropolitan Police developed elaborate systems for warning favored establishments about impending raids, while ensuring that enough arrests were made to satisfy public demands for moral enforcement. The press played a crucial role in maintaining this system of organized hypocrisy. Newspapers that exposed the activities of working-class vice dens, while ignoring the far more elaborate establishments serving the wealthy, weren't engaging in accidental oversight. Publishers and editors understood that their own social and economic positions depended on maintaining the fiction that respectable society was above such behaviors. The most insidious aspect of this media manipulation was how it shaped public understanding of Victorian sexuality itself. By focusing exclusively on the most desperate and visible forms of prostitution, newspapers created a narrative that portrayed vice as something that happened only among the lowest classes. Readers could feel appropriately shocked and morally superior while remaining completely ignorant of the far more extensive networks operating in their own neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the same publications that ran sensational exposés of street walking carried discreet advertisements that served the hidden economy they pretended to condemn. Personal columns became elaborate marketplaces where coded language facilitated connections between buyers and sellers of forbidden services. A casual reader might see innocent requests for companionship or employment, but those familiar with the terminology understood they were viewing a sophisticated catalogue of available pleasures. The Church provided perhaps the most spectacular example of institutional complicity in this web of deception. Victorian Christianity placed enormous emphasis on sexual purity, with ministers delivering thundering sermons about the dangers of carnal temptation. Yet many of these same religious leaders were deeply involved in the very networks they publicly condemned. Parish records reveal clergymen who maintained unusually close relationships with charitable organizations that claimed to rescue fallen women. These rescue missions often served as recruitment centers, where vulnerable women were identified and gradually introduced to more profitable forms of employment. The language of Christian redemption provided perfect cover for activities that had nothing to do with spiritual salvation. Some of the most exclusive pleasure establishments operated under religious pretenses. Private chapels in fashionable districts hosted evening services that combined spiritual ritual with distinctly earthly entertainments. Members of these congregations understood that participation required absolute discretion, bound together by shared complicity in activities that would destroy them if exposed. The theological justifications developed to rationalize this behavior were remarkably sophisticated. Certain interpretations of Scripture were promoted that emphasized the natural sinfulness of human nature, suggesting that indulgence was inevitable and therefore better managed than suppressed. Ancient religious practices were studied and selectively recreated, providing scholarly cover for activities that bore little resemblance to genuine historical worship. Letters between prominent religious figures reveal detailed discussions about managing the spiritual needs of wealthy parishioners whose requirements extended beyond conventional pastoral care. Bishops and archdeacons developed elaborate systems for handling situations where their most important supporters required discreet assistance with personal matters that couldn't be discussed in normal church settings. The education system played its own role in perpetuating these contradictions. Elite schools and universities that claimed to instill moral character in Britain's future leaders were often the very places where young men first learned about the hidden pleasures available to those with sufficient wealth and discretion. Oxford and Cambridge maintained traditions that officially emphasized classical learning and Christian virtue, while actually serving as finishing schools for participation in adult vice networks. Secret societies within these institutions provided graduated introductions to increasingly elaborate forms of forbidden entertainment. Students learned not just Latin and Greek, but the coded languages and discrete protocols that would serve them throughout their adult lives. The most prestigious schools employed staff who understood their roles, extended far beyond academic instruction. Certain tutors and housemasters served as informal guides to London's hidden pleasures, introducing carefully selected students to establishments that catered to educated clientele. These relationships continued long after graduation, creating lifelong networks of mutual obligation and shared secrets. Academic societies that claimed to study ancient history and classical civilization often used their scholarly credentials to justify elaborate recreations of supposedly historical practices. Archaeological expeditions became opportunities for wealthy participants to explore activities that would be scandalous if practiced openly, but became intellectually respectable when presented as historical research. The international dimension of this hidden economy revealed its truly staggering scope. Victorian London wasn't an isolated example of moral hypocrisy, but rather the center of networks that extended across Europe and beyond. Wealthy British gentlemen maintained regular correspondence with contacts in Paris, Vienna, and other sophisticated cities, sharing information about establishments and services available to traveling clients. Continental Europe offered opportunities for behaviors that were difficult to arrange safely in London. Elaborate tours disguised as cultural or medical expeditions provided cover for wealthy Britons to indulge appetites that required more exotic settings. These journeys were carefully planned to appear respectable, while facilitating access to pleasures that couldn't be obtained at home. The most adventurous clients organized expeditions to distant colonies, where imperial authority provided protection from moral oversight. India, particularly, became notorious among certain circles for offering experiences that would be impossible to arrange in civilized society. Military officers and colonial administrators developed extensive networks that catered to the most elaborate and forbidden desires of visiting dignitaries. Trade relationships facilitated these international pleasure networks in ways that revealed the global scope of Victorian hypocrisy. Merchant vessels carried more than commercial cargo, often serving as discreet transport for individuals and services that operated outside normal social boundaries. Port cities became crucial nodes in networks that connected hidden economies across vast distances. The diplomatic corps played essential roles in maintaining these international connections. Embassy staff and trade representatives understood that their effectiveness depended partly on their ability to facilitate the personal requirements of important visitors and business partners. Consular services extended far beyond their official duties, providing discreet assistance with arrangements that couldn't appear in formal diplomatic correspondence. As the Victorian era progressed, these hidden networks became increasingly sophisticated and interconnected. What had begun as isolated pockets of hypocrisy evolved into systematic alternatives to official society. Parallel institutions developed that provided all the services and social connections that respectable society offered, but without its moral constraints. Private banks, exclusive clubs, discreet hotels, and specialized services created complete ecosystems where wealthy individuals could live entirely separate lives. These shadow communities operated with their own hierarchies, customs, and codes of conduct that often directly contradicted the public values their participants claimed to uphold. The psychological impact of this systematic deception extended far beyond individual participants. Entire generations grew up understanding that official morality was performative rather than genuine, that success required mastering the art of public virtue while privately pursuing whatever pleasures wealth could purchase. This cynicism about moral authority would eventually contribute to the social transformations that ended the Victorian era itself. The most devastating aspect of this elaborate deception wasn't the hypocrisy itself, but how it systematically destroyed the lives of those who couldn't afford protection. While wealthy participants moved seamlessly between their public and private worlds, the women who served their desires faced consequences that revealed the true brutality of Victorian moral standards. Consider the fate of Sarah Matthews, a seamstress who supplemented her income through discreet evening arrangements with respectable gentlemen. When she became pregnant by one of her clients, a prominent member of parliament who publicly championed family values, she discovered the harsh reality of how this shadow society protected itself. The gentleman simply denied any connection to her, his word automatically accepted over hers. Sarah found herself not only dismissed from her legitimate employment, but blacklisted from respectable society entirely. The system had elaborate mechanisms for disposing of inconvenient evidence. Pregnant women who threatened to expose their wealthy lovers often found themselves committed to private asylums, their conditions diagnosed as hysteria or moral insanity. These institutions, many of them run by the same religious organizations that preached sexual purity, served as dumping grounds for women whose continued existence threatened important men's reputations. Death rates in these asylums were extraordinarily high, though official records attributed the mortality to the women's inherent moral corruption rather than deliberate neglect. Treatment consisted of isolation, starvation, and experimental procedures that bore more resemblance to torture than medicine. The few women who survived these ordeals emerged broken in spirit, their stories dismissed as the ravings of mad women. But perhaps even more chilling was how the system recruited its next generation of victims. Workhouses and orphanages, supposedly charitable institutions dedicated to moral uplift, operated as training grounds for future exploitation. Young girls were carefully evaluated for their potential usefulness, with the most attractive and compliant selected for special education that had nothing to do with legitimate employment. These children learned to read and write, to speak properly, and to conduct themselves with the refinement that wealthy clients expected. They were taught music, dancing, and conversation skills that would make them suitable companions for sophisticated gentlemen. What they weren't taught was that they were being groomed for lives that would offer temporary luxury at the cost of their souls and their futures. The recruitment process was insidiously gradual. A promising girl might first be selected as a special assistant to the matron, given better food and clothing as rewards for her cooperation. Gradually, she would be introduced to visitors who took interest in her education and development. These benefactors would provide additional training and eventually offer positions in their households that seemed like remarkable opportunities for advancement. Only when it was too late would these young women understand the true nature of their employment. By then, they were trapped in a web of dependence and complicity that made escape nearly impossible. They had been removed from legitimate society, trained for no other form of work, and compromised in ways that made return to respectability unthinkable. The Victorian era finally crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions, but not before consuming countless lives in its machinery of organized deception. The women who served this shadow economy, the children groomed for exploitation, the families destroyed by systematic hypocrisy, their suffering was the true cost of maintaining the fiction of moral purity while indulging every forbidden desire wealth could purchase. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the scale of the hypocrisy, but how completely the evidence was buried beneath layers of respectable narrative. For over a century, historians perpetuated the myth of Victorian moral superiority, ignoring the mountains of evidence that revealed a society built on the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable by those who claimed moral authority. The shadow networks that operated behind those respectable facades didn't disappear when the Victorian era ended. They simply evolved, adapted, and found new ways to hide in plain sight. The same mechanisms that allowed wealthy Victorians to live double lives while maintaining their reputations continue to operate today, protected by wealth, influence, and society's willingness to look the other way when confronting uncomfortable truths becomes inconvenient. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how this story forces us to question what other elaborate systems of organized deception we might be living alongside right now. How many respectable institutions might be serving purposes that contradict everything they publicly claim to represent? The Victorian era's greatest trick wasn't hiding its brothels and secret orgies. It was convincing us that such systematic moral fraud belonged safely in the past, that we had somehow evolved beyond the capacity for such breathtaking hypocrisy. But the ghosts of those forgotten women, those exploited children, those destroyed families still walk among us, reminding us that behind every era's claims of moral progress lie the same eternal human appetites for power, pleasure, and the devastating willingness to sacrifice others to maintain our own comfortable illusions.